Hey, this is Shaun. I'm getting ready to upload one of my classic demos to tide you over until I get my new material recorded. The 4-song demo was released under my hip-hop name SCM back in 2000, and it was called The Underground Affair. It was a mix of classic old-school hip-hop with some new cutting-edge electronics based on some software that I had just gotten a hold of, which hadn't even been released to the general public yet. To give you some perspective on when this demo was released, most of the hip-hop and rap that was coming out was still based off of keyboards and samplers and drum machines as separate components, and a lot of it was still sounding kind of like Dr. Dre or 90s radio rap, things like that. And I had kind of bypassed that period. I grew up on 80s hip-hop, and when the 90s came around, I thought most of it was boring, so I didn't even get into that stuff. So after I had played in a number of bands throughout the 90s in different styles of music, I decided to finally get back to releasing some hip-hop stuff. And instead of going with the sounds that were going on at the time, I wanted to go back to the old styles like Public Enemy or the Dust Brothers production, where it was noisier and heavier, but I didn't want to do it through the old school samplers that they were doing. I wanted to do it through the newest cutting edge technology. So I was using software synthesizers that hadn't even been released to the public yet. The program that I did a lot of the demo with was called Reason. And now Reason is pretty well known, but then Reason 1.0 hadn't been released for another 6 months. But because of a music store I was working at, I managed to get a beta pre-release of it prior to the main release. So it was the first program to really combine cutting-edge analog synthesizing software with drum machines and digital looping software, and it was all together in one digital studio. Now, they're on Reason 10 now, and it's advanced a lot since then, but at the time that I did this demo, there was really nothing else like it. And I think it was a big part of why the sound of this demo was very ahead of its time. To give you a perspective on where underground hip-hop was at, most of the big underground hip-hop labels were either non-existent yet or just barely getting started. For example, Rhymesayers I think barely had anything out. I hadn't even heard of them at the time, and if you look at what they were doing in the year 2000, most of it was still pretty raw. And Definitive Jux or Def Jux didn't even start releasing most of their stuff till a couple years later. I think the only thing that had been out at that time was one Mr. Lif album. And LP's Fantastic Damage, for example, I think came out about a year and a half after my demo did. And that was really the first thing after my demo that really started using electronics and synthesizers in hip-hop. So we're talking about a year and a half between when I started putting the synthesizers together on this Underground Affair demo and when it really broke into the underground, largely through some of the mid-period Definitive Jux that was going on. The first song on the demo was called Hip Hop on Wax, but contrary to its title, it did not sound like hip hop. If you sped it up about 200%, it might have started to sound like hip hop. But I had dropped everything down to bass level tempos to try to get some noise and atmosphere going on. I was coming off the heels of an industrial project that I had been working on in the mid-90s, and I was in a phase where I was going into clubs in Chicago to check out this underground electronic noise. And a lot of the underground electronic noise that was happening at the time, you'd have these guys walking with a rack of computers and a table full of all these guitar effects and things, and they were just going for creating whatever kind of noises they could, running the electronics into distortion pedals, wah-wahs, delays, and I had done a lot of that stuff with my industrial project, and now I was kind of moving into the software synthesizers that were just starting. The second song on the demo is called The Prisoner, and The Prisoner has a basic hip-hoppy, rocky kind of backbeat to it with these eerie synthesizers droning over the top, going in and out of different kinds of dissonance to create this really electric kind of mood. It originally was intended for me to put down some scratches over the beginning with some samples, but I ran into issues with getting the permission to use the samples I wanted to use, and I never actually got the turntable scratch part recorded. So the way it is now, it's still the basic backbeat with the eerie synthesizers over the top. When the lyrics kick in, I think you're gonna realize that there wasn't anything going on like this at the time. I still don't think there is now, because the song is basically about the change that was going on in the psychological fields at the time, where things were transferring from the mind frame of psychology into the new mind frame of the neurosciences that were built up. And if you look historically at the science that was going on in that period, the 90s were still very philosophical in their approach to psychology, where once you got into 2005, 2010, neuroscience and a very mind-based, biological-based understanding of psychology had started to come in. So if you look at the lyrics, it's about being a mental prisoner, and it combines some of the old aspects of the psychology that came before with some of the cutting-edge ideas of neuroscience, which were just starting to be discovered and take a foothold on our thought about how the mind works. The third song on the demo is called Diagnosis. Now, back in the early 90s, I had released a few hip-hop albums. I'll tell you more about those later. But I had kind of stopped for a while because I didn't like what was going on with the hip-hop scene, and my projects in other genres looked like they were going to be more successful. So I put the time and energy into that because at the time I felt like I connected more with those other styles of music. But I said on the last album that I released that I was going to come back and I was going to do more hip-hop. And the song Diagnosis was sort of my catharsis, letting all of the rage I had felt about a lot of the garbage that I thought was coming out in the name of hip hop. And I had grown up where hip hop had a harder hitting consciousness to it, and the drums and the noise, everything was harder hitting. And in the 90s, most of it was more streamlined, it was more bassy, less in your face with the treble and the sampling, and it had slowed down a lot. I remember when I was a kid, I would pick up new hip-hop albums, and the cool thing was seeing how fast people were going, and how fast the beats were getting, how fast the rhyming was getting, and how intricate it was getting. And it had kind of taken a few steps back, in my opinion, in the 90s. And I was going and I was doing these battle raps in some different groups and at some universities, and the common thing that people were saying about my style is, oh, that's not smooth enough to be hip-hop. Or it's too hard to be hip-hop, it sounds more like rock, or they're coming up with any excuse they can to argue that what I was doing was not hip-hop because they were comparing it to whatever their radio hits were at the time. But these are people who thought that they had been steeped in hip-hop, but they had no idea what any of this 80s stuff was. They had never heard Run DMC, they had never heard Eric B. and Rakim, they had never heard Public Enemy, they didn't know anything about this. To them, hip-hop started with Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre in 1992. And everything to them was this softer, more laid back in the sun, cruising around in your car kind of hip-hop. And I never got into that. So the song Diagnosis was kind of my diagnosis of what I saw going on in hip hop and what I felt could kind of bring hip hop into the future. And I did it in a classic battle rap style. So a lot of what I'm saying there is very cocky in a battle rap kind of way. But I made it kind of come together in the end in a circle. When I post it, check out the lyrics, see if you know what I mean. The fourth and last song on the demo is my favorite on there. It's the title song, The Underground Affair. And I wanted to go back to doing the old school, speedy rapping hip hop style that I grew up on, but I kind of took it up a notch. And now there's a lot of people that are doing super ultra fast, mostly in kind of a triplet format. And at the time, I was throwing in some triplets, but this was before this triplet movement happened, and at a time where everyone was slowing down, and I wanted to go back to fast. So if you compare it to some of the stuff that's out now, maybe it's not as fast, but if you compare it to what was going on in 2000, it was really fast for its time. And the lyrics were about underground music, underground movement, and some historical perspective in it. I even compared the underground hip hop movement to different periods of classical music where Bach had been criticized for some of the steps forward in music he took at his time, or Beethoven had been criticized for some things such as his Seventh Symphony, where he had these bass lines that were sliding up and down in this grinding fashion. So in a tribute to that, instead of using the synthesizers on this track, I dug out my old vinyl and I took a record of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. And a lot of people, when they hear this song, they're like, wow, those are some really fat sounding synthesizers. And then I inform them they're not synthesizers. I sampled all of this off of a Beethoven Seventh Symphony record. So check it out, see if you can figure out where I got the symphony from, see if you can figure out how it's worked in, but pretty much all of the music in it, except for the drum beats, come out of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, including the grinding bass slides that I'm talking about and reference in the song. So over the next few days, I'm gonna start uploading the tracks one by one. And keep in mind, it was a demo, it's pretty raw. Some of the emceeing on it is not refined. I intended to come back and do an album later, but I ended up having to move away from Chicago and go to work in Florida, and I didn't get the final version of it done. But the demo version that you're gonna hear is the original one that I cut before I left Chicago. It's the one that got circulated to a bunch of DJs in Chicago, in the suburbs, some in New York, some in Tampa, and it was going around. I never made a cover for it or anything. The original copies, if you ever see one, the ones that came from me anyway, it was just the CDR written on it in a Sharpie, SCM, the Underground Affair, in my really crappy handwriting. And that's the way it was, so I'm gonna give you that version now. Take it for what it is. At the time, I think I was doing something no one else was doing, and I'm still proud that I have this in my past discography now. You might not know how it stands up to modern production. That's okay. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Please subscribe. Please tell your friends so that you can check this out when I start uploading the tracks. Thank you.